The political calculation, though, is so fascinating from the Republican side, I think.
How so?
Right? Well, as Cantor walked out, there's a lot of pluses and minuses in that for him, right? On the one hand, he seems tough, and he's standing up against tax increases, which plays well to the Republican constituency. At the same time, there is a risk for Republicans. It's seeming to be reckless at a moment where we really are in some very, very dicey financial situations. And if the deal in the end doesn't include something from both sides, some cuts, which Republicans are pushing for, and some revenue increases, which Democrats believe needs to be part of the equation, unless this includes both of them, there will not be a deal.
See, Michael, Ellis used the word reckless, saying that the Republicans could come off looking reckless. I would argue, and I think a lot of other people would, that it's the Democrats who could come off looking reckless in the eyes of voters if they don't go along with cutting spending in a way that is commensurate with how they need to raise the debt limit.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of talk about the Republicans at risk here, right, about not making a deal. But the underlying reality is that if the financial catastrophe happens, it's going to happen on a Democratic watch, and it's going to be catastrophic for the Democrats. It's going to be bad for the Republicans, but it's going to be a Herbert Hoover moment for the Democrats. And I don't think anybody really talks about that too much.
Yeah, it wasn't kind of the way it played out last time, was it, when the Republicans shut down the government? I think that bounced differently. But Rick, we have a situation where essentially the Democrats have embraced the idea of cutting. There's not a single Democrat who's really making an argument that says we don't have to do some cutting here.
Right.
I think at this point, that's a kind of Republicans have won that part of the argument. It's the other part of the argument that there has been no movement on, which is the idea that somewhere in there, after all these years of Bush tax cuts, after all the loopholes we've been hearing about, these huge companies that are paying no taxes at all, these breaks for sending jobs overseas, that stuff has to get reeled in and has to be part of the equation, I would argue. But at this point, Republicans are locked into a situation with their own constituents that they've made these Grover Norquist pledges. Their candidates are running on a no new taxes ever under any circumstances. And it's made a deal very, very difficult to reach.
Michael, is that tough? And have the Republicans sort of painted themselves in a corner on those no new tax pledges? And do you think that maybe there should be the so-called millionaire tax? Maybe not the $250,000 threshold, but perhaps people making $1–2 million a year. Is there any way that Republicans would sign on to a plan that would raise taxes for those people?
I think the Republicans are probably going to sign on to something that removes subsidies in the code, right? But I gotta be honest with you. It's funny that the Democrats are in favor of cuts. The Democrats are in favor of cuts only in the subjunctive. The Senate, which has been run by the Democrats now for coming on 6 years, hasn't passed a budget in 2 years. They never vote on cuts. They always vote on tax increases. I mean, it's a lot of rhetoric. It's not a lot of go.
Is it a lot of rhetoric, or do you believe that these Democrats are sincere when they talk about? I mean, would they be talking about cutting if it weren't for the Republicans, Ellis?
Nobody likes to cut. I mean, all these programs have constituencies, and many of them actually help people. We can take money away from health care, education, or law enforcement. I mean, we'd rather not have to cut anything. But Democrats have clearly, and these negotiations are an example of that, have clearly signed on to the idea that we do have to do some cutting. It seems to me the principles are very simple, guys. It's that everything at a time like this needs to be on the table. And you can't say we'll only do the half that we love. We'll only attack your constituents and not ours. In a time of crisis like this, everything has to be open to discussion, including things that I would find very painful. Some entitlement cuts. I mean, maybe we have to do some stuff, rethinking about some of the ways we take care of the most vulnerable in our society. All those things have to be on the table. Military, revenue enhancements, all of it. How can you have a discussion at this point where you say there's a huge part of this conversation we just refuse to have based on some pledge to Grover Norquist? That just seems irresponsible to me.